I was 9 years old the first time I understood that somewhere, in a house I had never visited, in a family I did not yet know, a boy was being shaped into the man who would one day have authority over my life. I did not understand it in those words. I was 9, and I had no framework for that kind of knowing. What I had was a moment, small and ordinary on its surface, that lodged itself in me the way certain moments do. Not because they are dramatic, but because something beneath your comprehension recognizes them as important before your mind has the language to say why. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my schoolwork, and my father was talking to my older brother Daniel at the doorway. And my father said something I was not meant to hear. Something about how Daniel would need to learn to manage a household and manage a wife, because a man who could not lead his home was a man who could not lead anything. Daniel was 11. He nodded with the seriousness of a boy being handed something real, and my father clapped him on the shoulder and went back outside. I sat at that table with my pencil in my hand, and I felt, without being able to name it, the very particular loneliness of understanding that a conversation about your future was happening in rooms you were never invited into. Before we go any further, there is something I want to say from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching right now have not yet subscribed. And perhaps that would not matter so much if these stories were just words. But they are not just words. They are the things that happened before we were old enough to understand they were happening. The teachings that shaped us before we knew we were being shaped. The rooms we were never invited into, where our futures were being decided. So, if you have ever found comfort, recognition, or even just a piece of yourself in these videos, please subscribe. It is completely free, and it helps this community keep growing. And while you are here, tell me in the comments, was there ever a moment in your childhood when you understood, without anyone saying it directly, exactly what kind of life was being prepared for you? What they teach Amish boys about their future wives is not taught in a single lesson, and it is not written in any book I ever held in my hands. It is taught the way the most durable things are always taught, through repetition and example and the 1,000 daily demonstrations of what is normal, what is expected, what is simply the way things are and have always been and will continue to be long after the people demonstrating them are in the ground. It begins early, earlier than anyone would think to examine. It begins in the way a household is organized around the comfort and authority of the father, so that a boy grows up understanding at the level of his body, not his mind, that a home is a place that runs on a woman's labor and operates according to a man's preferences, and that this arrangement is so natural and so correct that it requires no discussion, no justification, no acknowledgement of any kind. The fish does not discuss the water. The boy does not discuss the arrangement. He simply grows up inside it and carries its shape into every room he will ever inhabit for the rest of his life. My brother Daniel was not a bad boy. I say this first because it is true and because it matters. He was curious and kind, and he had a gift for fixing mechanical things that gave him a quiet satisfaction I always admired. He became, in time, a man who was not cruel to his wife, who provided for his children, who was respected in our community for his steadiness and his fairness in dealings with other men. He was also a man who had been so thoroughly educated in his own authority before he was old enough to question it, that the education was invisible to him, the way your own face is invisible to you unless you are standing in front of a mirror. He could not see it. He had been inside it too long. The teaching happened in layers. The first layer was practical. Boys learned to farm and to build and to manage animals and to negotiate with other men and to handle money. Girls learned to cook and to sew and to clean and to preserve and to manage children. These were presented as complementary, as the two halves of a whole, and in a purely functional sense, they were. But the complementarity was not equal, and everyone understood this, even if no one said it. The man's work produced income and standing and the ability to make decisions about land and animals and futures. The woman's work produced the conditions under which the man's work was possible. One half of the equation was visible. The other half was infrastructure. And no one in my memory ever stood at the front of a room and said, "These two things are of equal value. These two people are of equal worth." It was assumed. It was assumed in the way that benefits the people for whom the assumption is convenient. The second layer was theological. Boys were taught from the time they could sit still in a church service that God had ordained a hierarchy in the home, that the husband was the head and the wife was the heart, and that this was not a human arrangement but a divine one, unchangeable and unchallengeable, rooted in Scripture and confirmed by generations of faithful people who had lived by it and built something lasting. The word submitted came up often in these teachings. A wife who submitted was a wife who understood God's design. A wife who did not submit was a wife who was, in some essential and spiritual sense, in rebellion, not just against her husband, but against the order of creation itself. I heard this taught to the boys in our community. I heard it taught at church and at the dinner table, and in the conversations men had with their sons on the edges of fields and in the cool shadows of barns. And the boys absorbed it the way they absorbed everything their fathers told them about the world, as fact, as foundation, as the ground beneath their feet. The third layer was the one nobody named out loud. It was the layer of expectation, the detailed and specific picture that was painted for boys, piece by piece across the years of their growing up, of what a wife was supposed to be and do and feel and want. A picture so complete and so thoroughly reinforced that by the time a boy became a man looking for a wife, he already knew exactly what he was looking for. And what he was looking for was not a person. It was a role filled by a person. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a marriage and an arrangement. And I spent years of my life living inside the confusion between them before I found words for what I was trying to describe. I know what was in that picture because I was raised alongside boys who were being shown it, because I watched what was praised and what was corrected, because I listened at the edges of conversations and I observed what happened to women who fit the picture and what happened to women who did not. The picture looked like this. A wife is capable without being proud of her capability. She is present without demanding presence in return. She is warm and she is steady, and she does not require explanation for decisions that have already been made. She does not ask where her husband has been. She does not question how the money is spent. She does not have needs that arrive at inconvenient times or feelings that make the household uncomfortable to inhabit. She is the temperature of the home. She is responsible for whether it is a place a man wants to return to. If he does not want to return to it, that is a failure of her management, not a reflection of his choices. I watched this picture being handed to boys, and I watched girls being shaped simultaneously in the house next door and the house across the lane and in every kitchen and schoolroom in our district, into the thing the picture required. The shaping of girls is a different story, and one I have told in pieces across many weeks in this space. But what I want to talk about today is the shaping of boys, because I think it is the part that gets spoken about least. And because I believe that until you understand what was put into a boy before he became the man who sat across the table from you, you cannot fully understand what you were actually dealing with in the years you spent trying to reach him. A boy who grows up watching his mother's needs treated as subordinate to his father's preferences does not learn that women are inferior. He learns something more subtle and more durable. He learns that women's needs are a category of thing that can be managed rather than met, accommodated rather than answered, and that this management is in fact a form of care. He has watched his father his whole life, and his father managed his mother, and his mother accepted the management, and the household ran, and the children were fed, and the community respected the family, and everything appeared to work. So the boy carries that model into his own marriage, and he manages his wife, and he genuinely believes he is caring for her, and he is confused and then defensive when she seems to require something he does not know how to give, something that was never demonstrated to him, something that perhaps does not have a name in the language he was raised to speak. I am not excusing it. I want to be precise about that. I am explaining it, because explanation and excuse are different things, and because I spent too many years of my marriage unable to distinguish between them, collapsing every attempt at understanding into either his fault or mine, when the truth was larger and older and sadder than either of those options. There was a man in our community named Reuben, a neighbor of my parents, a man I had known my whole life. He was known as a good husband by every measure our community possessed. He built his wife Hannah a summer kitchen so she would not have to work over a hot stove in the heat of July. He never raised his voice in public. He brought her back a gift from every trip he took to town. A small thing, a spool of thread or a paper of pins, nothing grand, but consistent, year after year. The gesture of a man who had been taught that acknowledgement was part of provision. Hannah spoke of him with a quiet pride that was genuine. I did not doubt that she loved him. I do not doubt it now. I also remember watching Hannah at a community meeting the year the district was deciding whether to permit a new kind of equipment on the farms. Every family was represented. The men sat on one side and discussed, and the women sat on the other side and did not discuss. And the decision was made by the men and announced to the women, and that was the end of it. Hannah had opinions about that decision. I knew because she had spoken about it in her kitchen 2 days before the meeting, clearly and with considerable knowledge of the practical implications. At the meeting, she sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing. Afterward, walking home, Reuben put his hand briefly on her back in a gesture that was kind and proprietary in equal measure. And Hannah, good Hannah, loved and cared for and given summer kitchens and paper of pins, looked at the road ahead of her with an expression I recognized from my own mother's face at the kitchen window. The expression of someone standing at the edge of a field they have decided not to walk into. Reuben was a good husband by what he had been taught a good husband was, and what he had been taught was incomplete. Not maliciously incomplete, structurally incomplete. The structure had left out the part about her interior life, the part about her opinions mattering beyond the kitchen, the part about love that does not simply provide and manage, but actually wants to know. And Reuben had never been shown that missing part, because the men who taught him had never been shown it either, and the men who taught them, and back and back and back through the generations of fathers and sons who had been handed the same incomplete picture, and faithfully, dutifully, in good conscience, passed it forward. I married into this. I married a man who was not Reuben's cruelty and not my father's distance, and not any of the clear, simple villains that stories sometimes offer you as explanation. I married a man who was the product of a specific and thorough education about what I was before he had ever met me. And the difficulty of our years together was not the difficulty of two bad people, or even two incompatible people. It was the difficulty of a woman who had been shaped to fit a picture, trying to exist as a person, inside a marriage to a man who had been taught that the picture was the person, and who did not know, who had never been shown, how to see the difference. I left our community in my late 20s, and it took me years of quiet and therapy and the long, patient work of learning to trust my own perception to understand what I have just told you. To stop being angry at Eli as a man and start understanding him as a product. To stop asking why he could not see me and start asking what he had been given to see with. To hold, at the same time and without resolving the contradiction, both the truth that what was done to me was real and damaging, and the truth that the man who did it had himself been shaped by something he could not name and had not chosen. I think about Daniel sometimes. My brother with his gift for fixing things, and his 11-year-old face receiving my father's hand on his shoulder, and the weight of all that education settling into his bones. I think about what he was given and what he was not given, and what the girls in our community were given and what they were not given, and the long, intricate, invisible system that managed all of this so efficiently that it required no enforcement because it had already been internalized by everyone inside it before they were old enough to consent to the internalization. I think about what it would have meant for a boy in our community to be taught something different. To be taught that the girl he would someday marry was a person with an interior life as complex and real as his own. That her needs were not a category of thing to be managed, but a set of things to be genuinely met. That a home was not a place that ran on her labor for his comfort, but a shared life that belonged equally to both of them. That leading did not mean deciding alone, but deciding together. That love was not provision and management, but the actual desire to know and be known by another human being across all the years of a life. I think about what that boy would have become. I think about what that marriage would have looked like. I think about the woman who would have sat across the table from him and felt, perhaps for the first time in her life, that she was being seen rather than managed, that she was a person rather than a role, that the life being built around her was being built with her rather than for her, which is a different thing entirely, and one that I did not fully understand the difference between until I was standing on the outside of everything I had known and feeling, for the first time, the specific quality of air in a life where I was allowed to take up the space I actually occupied. Your future was discussed in rooms you were never invited into. The shape of the life being prepared for you was decided before you were old enough to have an opinion about it. That is true. And it is also true that the boy across the table from you was handed an incomplete picture and told it was the whole thing, and that his failure to see you fully was not only his failure. It was the failure of every man who taught him and every man who taught those men, all the way back to the beginning of a system that served itself by making sure nobody inside it ever looked at it directly. You were never the problem. You were never the thing that needed to be managed. You were always, already, the whole point. And no education, however early and however thorough, has the final authority to make that untrue. Before you leave, I want to thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know there are countless stories you could have given your time to today, and you spent these moments here, in this kitchen, with these words. But there is something I want to be honest with you about. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos have not yet subscribed. And if these stories have ever made you feel seen, if they have ever handed you a word for something you have been carrying without a name, I hope you will subscribe. It is free, and it is how these voices stay alive and keep reaching the people who need them. And before you go, tell me in the comments, was there ever a moment when you realized that someone had been taught things about you before they ever knew you? What did that understanding feel like when it arrived? I would love to read what you carry.